Hi, everyone. I've been thinking the last couple of days about why we live in an environment where there are so many different ideologies, so many different political thoughts, so many different philosophies, and why we really can't all get along. Why is it that in this day and age, with so much information out there and so many ways of receiving that information, that we are so at edge with each other? I know that this message will land on deaf ears, not because I have a really small audience, which I'm hoping it will grow, but just because it's just another voice that people will either ignore because they disagree with one thing or the other. But I wanted to put together my thoughts for what's going on, especially with protests all over the country. And I'm going to add to the noise by just giving a couple of things on my mind. I live in a suburbs west of the city of Chicago, and so it's not a really rich neighborhood. It's not a poor neighborhood. It's just a nice suburban town of all races, all kinds of people everywhere. And we see an incident happens on social media, and it ignites a country. We know that the 3-month lockdown has something to do with that as well. The psychology of people being kept inside and being forced and being scared. And then one incident it took to explode, and we have an abundance of energy all over the place. I had a conversation again, which is what usually drives my thoughts when I record these videos. And it was about the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, this is a very complicated issue. And no matter what somebody says, there are going to be perceptions about one thing or the other, which is why everything is a problem. Because here I am, a white guy in the suburbs of Chicago, trying to speak his mind about an issue that I can't possibly understand. And they're right, I can't understand it. I don't know what it's like to be anybody else but myself. I'm a white guy. It was an accident of birth, I guess. But I want to be able to share a message. A lot of people talk about compassion. They post these messages and they do it out of love. They want to be kind to everybody. They want to end racism because we need love and acceptance and tolerance. And on the surface, it's a wonderful message. It's a wonderful message to say we need to be tolerant of everybody. We need to have love for all mankind. And absolutely, that's the truth. But somehow this march, this ideology, this thought process that there is one distinct race or group of people that is more unfavored than any other group of people. I don't agree with that. Okay? Am I saying that racism doesn't exist? No, I'm not saying racism doesn't exist. I'm saying that racism is a part of life that everybody has to deal with. It's always been there historically. It always will be there. It's always one group over another group. You can talk about the Jews in the scriptures. For thousands of years, they were kept as slaves, right? You can talk about the Africans, right? And they were slaves on this continent for 400 years, and that's terrible. But there are other cultures that were slaves throughout all of history, right? And there are other cultures that were mocked and scorned and prejudiced against. So it's not just one community or the other. So yeah, we have an incident that seems to be a white person murdering a black person, and it's the police for all things that matter, right? And so we have this notion that we have a systemic racist problem in the country, right? And we see this happening all the time. We see black people getting oppressed, getting murdered, being harassed, and it's true, they are. I don't know why, but they are. But on the other hand, there are people who look like me who have our own challenges that we deal with. Are we harassed? Are we oppressed? Are we unfair treated? Well, I can acknowledge that yes, at times we are. Okay, whether you want to agree with me or not, we are untreated. Okay, But I don't see this as a racist thing, because white people are racist, black people are racist. Every culture has racism within it, and every culture has love and compassion with it. But getting back to love and compassion, right? That is a value that is high and it should be prioritized, okay? But I alluded to this conversation on one of my podcasts a while ago when I was talking to Bruce about the divine economic theory. And I talked about logos, ethos, and pathos. All right, those are Aristotelian terms. They're actually the three completions of the human mind. Pathos being the word, ethos, and of course logos. You can go back to the podcast to see what I'm talking about. But in my conversation, love was the top value, and I said I agree with love, but there are other values that are just as important. And I'm not here to say my values are any better than anyone else's, but when you talk about the completion of thought and compassion, you have to realize that ethos, logos, and pathos are all three that have completion, right? Ethos is that of credibility, of ethics. That's where ethos comes from, right? And so we want a system of superiority based on hierarchies and those things that happen naturally. This is all Jordan Peterson kind of stuff. But you need to have some kind of system of ethics that deals fairly in justice with everybody. Pathos is the passion, right? Compassion, empathy, sympathy, those kind of things really just help people feel. That's that compassion, that's that love. So it's only one part. We also need the ethical. And of course, logos is where the word logic comes from, right? So logic is the ability to look at statistics. And so when you're looking at the statistics of just crime in America, you're looking at the demographics of people, right? There is a logical order. There's a logical structure of how things, they just happen to be. For right or wrong, right? We have a larger demographic of white people in America, and you can go back to history and why that happens, than we do black people in America, right? They say that there's about 13% of black people in the United States. Okay, and then there's other divisions of other types of people. If you wanted to look at one demographic, which is the racial demographic, right? And then you have the gender demographic. We have men and women, and those who call them, transsexuals or transvestites, transgender rather. Whatever the political term is for that, they're going to consider themselves by a certain demographic. But that's logos. You have to understand that everything is demographic. So when you look at an incident, you have to ask yourself some questions, right? Is there racism in the country? Yes, absolutely. Now, how many people are going... Hi, sorry about that. My last video got cut off. Let's see if I can edit this together. I wanted to talk about the logical, statistical basis of demographics in this country. So the demographics are that white people are the majority. I don't know the percentage exactly by number, because they say that black people represent 13% of the total population of the country. And of course, there are other races. But that's just one category that you can identify and group people by is the racial demographic, right? I already talked about the other types of demographics. Well, you can look at the statistics of crime in the United States. But first you have to define exactly what you mean by crime, right? Because people will say one way or the other that a certain demographic may be statistically more likely to commit such and such a crime or become criminals, right? And then you can say, well, what is the bias on that? The bias is, okay, well, if 13% of this total population is one race and these are criminals, okay, so what types of crimes are you talking about? Because when it comes to law, I think that there's really only 7 words, if you've seen me before talk about this, 7 words that represent what a law should be based on. Don't hurt me, don't take my stuff, right? And so there are numerous victimless crimes out there, okay? When somebody commits a crime and there's no victim, I don't think that should be a law. So if you're talking about murdering somebody or raping somebody or stealing their stuff or putting them in physical harm with their property or their life, then there should be crime, right? But if you talk about somebody who is putting something in their body, a substance, a drug, a medicine, by whatever definition they want to call it, for whatever reason, whether it's recreation or whether it's intentional or whether it's for medicinal, it doesn't matter. They're hurting themselves or they're not, but it's their choice, it's their life. It should be no law. So things like possession of narcotics, right, or possession of marijuana, the substance, like all those laws, now they're going to look at statistics as to what type of culture commits crimes. Well, if there is a culture that is, for example, smoking weed more than other cultures do, and you say smoking weed is a crime, well then you can tie that race to that supposed crime, but they're not really hurting anybody. So the drug war is statistically biased to certain cultures, right? And that is one of the reasons why we have what we have in this country. So the drug war is a huge thing, right? Of course, there's also the element of cultural differences, right? And there's a whole nother podcast we can talk about that with cultural differences. But just like we have separate sections of the city. We might have Chinese town, right? Or we might have Korean town or Little Italy. We have all these different ethnic diversities in the towns. Well, all those diversities also have cultural aspects in this country. So there are certain races, there are certain cultures, there are certain ideologies that they're all different, right? And they're not going to agree with each other, okay? And so statistically, when it comes to crime and culture, when it comes to racism and culture, us all going to be statistically biased one perspective or another. So you can't have any kind of demographic, right? And with that being said, you have to talk about these violent crimes, right? So you look at black on black numbers, right? You look at white on black numbers, black on white numbers, whites on white numbers, right? And all those statistics are there that they can be manipulated. They can fit any kind of agenda, right? You can also look at how any particular statistic is going to be reported. Are the white on white crimes reported as much as the black on black crimes? Are the white on black crimes reported more than the black on white crimes? Either way, what is reported, right? So we have a social media bias or a media agenda, right? So of course, that's all going to be statistically ignored when your only message or your only value is love, right? So if you only value love and you think everybody should have compassion, you're right. But when you make it an agenda based on some kind of statistical manipulation, or even if you ignore statistics, you're forgetting the logos involved in the decision making, well then you're not going to be complete. Your story is just not complete because you're only focusing on the pathos, which is the love, and you're not looking at the logos, right? And then ethical thing, I mean, what is the ethic, right? You make sure that you're telling the truth, that you have conformity, that you have some kind of ethical would be justice, right? And so you have to look at the justice system. So yes, there's lots of problems with the justice system, but you can look at the statistics of the justice system. You can look at the compassion or lack of compassion in the justice system. So once again, if you're only focusing on one thing, the love element, right? Or you can, by the other way, you can only focus on the statistical numeration factor, right? But once again, statistics can be manipulated or ignored, and so you're not looking at the entire picture, right? So you do need that credibility. I think that's probably where ethics comes in, right? You need to have the credibility of the statistics you're saying without an agenda. So, said all that to say that love is important. Love is one of those things that we can't live without. And John Lennon is right when he's saying the song, "All You Need Is Love," right? That was a great song. I just said he was right, but he wasn't right. You need more than just love. You need love, you need compassion, of course, you need charity, but you also need logic and you need reason. And that's all I want to say today. Thanks. Have a good one.